10, 9, 8, 7, 6, stand by, 4, 3, counting to go on air, 2, 1, and a warm welcome to the GDB 2021 Re-Energise conference. For our next speaker now, Scott McArthur is going to talk to us about reinventing and being nimble, and the things that Angie was mentioning there for a big, huge company. How do you do that for yourself? As I mentioned earlier, Scott has a really, in my judgment, impressive video on his website. As a speaker, he and I and others in this industry have had to reinvent ourselves for a virtual world. And the showreel that Scott has put together of the imagination of the things you can do in a virtual world really inspired me. And that's why we're very lucky, I think, to have Scott here today. You can see a great background there on air, GDB Re-Energise, all set to go. Scott, tell us how to reinvent ourselves. Over to you, Scott McArthur.
I'd spent most of the night drinking half a bottle of whiskey, and I was lying in my bed looking forward to the day off the following day because it was Christmas. And at the time, I happened to work in the fish industry, and my main focus, I was HR director for one of the big food companies, a company they're now called Northern Foods. And it was, I think it was 4 o'clock in the morning. I was lying in a hotel room because I actually lived in Cheshire at the time, but I was living and working in Peterhead, or for any Scots in the room, Peterhead. And the phone rang, and it was my boss. Now, this was a bit weird because one, I was drunk, and two, I was on holiday, and we just really finished a really, frantic time, because Christmas, for those of you in manufacturing, will know that Christmas is the time you make your money. And some of us have just experienced the opposite of that, haven't we, during the COVID pandemic during Christmas. But we'd been working really hard dealing with what we called gold. And gold is the technical term we used in the fish industry for this stuff, salmon. We made more salmon than any other company in the world. We processed more salmon than any other company in the world. It was a massive, massive part of our business, and it made us a fortune. But the phone rang, as I said, and it was Jim, and Jim was my managing director. And he said, hello. And I was like, oh, you can imagine, I'm not going to say what I actually said because it wouldn't be appropriate. But he said, you need to get into the factory now. And I was like, Jim, are you kidding? He went, no, you need to come in now. The Jim is a very dear friend to this day. And I've never known him to sound like that. He's one of the most gentle people I've ever worked with in my career. So I thought, okay. So I got up. Obviously, I didn't drive. I called a taxi, got into the factory. It was only about 10 minutes away, but you don't go walking in Peterhead late at night. It's quite a scary place. Anyway, I got to the factory, and I walked into the boardroom. And in the boardroom, it was a classic boardroom, big mahogany board table, little desk at the far side. And here was Jim and all the other team in the room. I think I was second last to get there. I did have half a bottle of Speyside Malt inside me. But anyway, so he said, there's been a mistake. And I was like, oh, right, okay. Now, in manufacturing, you get mistakes. But he said, there's been a mistake, and it's a big one. And I was like, oh God. So we all sat down, and we had like the manufacturing team over here. We had the support staff over here. We had all the sort of technical people around about us. And he said, well, what's happened is in the fish factory, it's a huge fish factory. We had our own port. The boats used to come into we had our own little, I don't know, harbour, I guess you would call it. They would then let the salmon go down onto the ground, and we would process the salmon. And in one step of the salmon processing is a really important step. And for a particular client, which was Tesco, it was really important because this was the step where we looked at the quality of the meat. Now, if you've ever had salmon, you'll know that, most salmon is pink. Certainly most wild salmon is pink. That's a whole other story about other types of salmon. But on the back side of the salmon, you'll probably have seen the grey sort of brown meat on the salmon. Tesco's had their finest range, and on the Tesco's finest range salmon, there was no brown meat. And what we used to have was we had a process where the salmon would lie in a conveyor belt, and there'd be this ice laser. It was amazing. Ice laser would skim off the brown meat, and it would go really quick. And it turns out that I hadn't been the only person on the whiskey that night. 2 of the quality managers who were managing this machine had been drinking on site, and they'd got the setting wrong. Now, this is calamitous at the best of times, but at Christmas, it's even worse because the whole factory was busy making salmon for Tesco's. Hundreds of these things were going through the process. Dozens of tons of salmon were going all over the country. And it turns out what happened is, as I said, they'd got drunk. They hadn't taken the brown meat off, but because of the process, it came straight out of that machine, into the wrapping machine, into boxes, into trucks, and off to the distribution centres. So here was Tesco's with their biggest day ahead of them in terms of sales, with brown meat on their finest salmon. What on earth are we going to do? So Jim, I said he was a gentleman, he's a quiet man. He was raging, but he was holding it back. And he said, what are we going to do? So there was a debate in the room about, well, we just don't tell them. We'll let the customers find them, and there might be the occasional complaint. Others were going, oh my God, we're going to have to recall them. There's not 15 tons of salmon lying around anywhere. You can't just replace it. That means all these hundreds and hundreds of thousands of people would not have their salmon for Christmas Day. So Jim said, but this time it was at 5:30 in the morning. He said, I'm going to phone the sales director. And we were all like, oh, and he did it in front of us. I'm actually shaking. It's amazing. I haven't told this story for a wee while. I'm actually shaking telling you the story. So Jim called the sales director, and she, you can imagine, she was tired and she wasn't very pleased to get a call at 5:30 in the morning. And the air did go pretty blue, if I'm honest. But Jim stayed really cool. And he said, look, really sorry. I promise we're going to investigate this. He didn't tell her that they'd been drunk on duty, but he said, I promise we're going to investigate this. And let's talk. So they had a chat, and we could all hear it. It was on speakerphone. And basically, we gave them a bit of a reduction, and he offered to send our staff in buses from Peterhead, and that's a way up at the far north of Scotland. You think Aberdeen's up north? It's proper north. But we would send our people down to the main distribution centre just outside Edinburgh before it got out to the rest of the UK. So we did that. And for some, well, she said, okay, and she agreed. What do you think happened the next Christmas? What do you think happened? Well, I'll tell you what happened. Tesco's doubled their order. They came back and they said, of all the suppliers that we've worked with, you're the only supplier in the last 10 years that's been honest, that's told us the truth. And Jim was such a good leader that, I mean, it was almost like osmotic. And that's the first thing I want you to think about, because I think, my talk's called Renaissance, that basically means rebirth. I think the lesson from Jim, and it's stuck, honestly, guys, that was 20 years ago, and it's stuck with me forever. And I think Jim was an example 20 years ago of how I would like, and I'm not going to say it's definitely going to happen, but how I would like to see leaders develop in the next few years. Now, what Angie said earlier about we'll be judged on how we behave and how we conduct ourselves during COVID is going to be really important to us. Absolutely. So the takeaway I'd like you to get from that little story that's given me goosebumps is this. The leaders that we've been up to this point, not all of us, but many of us, and I mean, I've worked in a couple hundred companies, and probably over 70% of leaders are like superheroes, like Steve Jobs. I don't think that's what we need, certainly not in the next 2 years. And indeed, what I think we need is more Jims. And do you know what? Jim's hobby is gardening. And he's retired now, and he lives just close. I live in the Cotswolds, and Jim's just over the hill here. It's amazing. He's quite local to me. And I think leaders need to be acting more like gardeners after the COVID pandemic. They need to be nurturing their staff. They need to be preparing the ground for the future. They need to be fertilizing. They need to be taking away the weeds and moving away the things that are preventing their people from flourishing. And Angie, I loved what you said about how you're doing that with your people. It's an absolutely beautiful example of what I would like to see. So that's the first thing, a transformation, a renaissance in leadership from the superhero to the gardener. One of my first jobs, well, it was my first job. That's actually my second. My first job was a kilt maker, but my second job involved these things, microscopes. I was a scientist, and I went from human remains to human resources. That's my best line. Anyway, I was working in research. I did arthritis research and a bit of brain research, hence why I've got brain up here. And I was in my second year there after university, and my professor, whose name was Dougal Gardner, called me in. Now, Dougal was a challenging chap, quite a difficult fella, but we had an okay relationship. I never called him Dougal at this point. His name was absolutely Sir. And Sir Dougal said, Scott, I've got a job for you. I'd like you to go into the lecture theatre, and I'd like you to start teaching third-year medics college and chemistry. Well, I'd never stood on my feet before. I'd never spoken in public before. I'd spoken a little bit at university, as most of us do, but I hadn't really done anything publicly. I knew my college and chemistry, so that wasn't a problem, but I was absolutely terrified. And now, if you've ever seen these old Frankenstein movies where you see the lecture theatre, it's like a shape like a cone with an operating table there, that's what it was like. And I was standing there with 423-year-olds, because they were all roughly that age in third year. I was 23, so I was standing there with 400 of my peers teaching them college and chemistry. Oof, it was an absolute disaster. I was terrible. 8 weeks of this, the poor souls, I used to have hair, I had long hair, and I used to come out and I was all stuck together, and it was on my lab coat. Oh, it was awful. But at the end of the 8 weeks, Dougal Gardner, his name, Professor Gardner, Sir, called me into his office. Now, I have to be honest, I really thought he was going to sack me. I really, really thought he was going to sack me. And he said, okay, in you come. And I went in and he said, sit down. And I thought, here we go, here we go. He said, how did you think you got on? And I was like, well, I didn't go on very well, Professor. It was a disaster. I don't think anyone learned anything. I never want to speak in public again. And he looked at me. Now, he kind of used to do this with his glasses. He looked at me and he said, right, he said, give yourself a grade. And I was like, oh, shit, A to F. And I went, well, F. I was terrible. It was a failure. I'm embarrassed that I did that. And he looked at me, and I really thought this was the moment where the P45 was going to come out. And he said, can I give you a grade? And I went, aye, okay. So I went a bit vernacular there. I went, yes, okay, Professor. And he said, right, I'm going to give you this grade. And again, the nose thing went like that. And he went, I'm going to give you a not yet. And I was like, what? What's that? What's that? What do you think he was doing? What do you think he was doing? 15 years later, this is now 5 years later, 5 years ago, sorry, I did my first TEDx talk. And I'd spent the best part of 15 years going around the world with KPMG and others, working at dozens of companies as an HR consultant. And I did my first TEDx, and it was in front of 3,000 people. It's the biggest one in Europe, down here in Warwick. And I invited Dougal, who was in his 90s at this point, and I said, could you come? He's now called Dougal because he was my friend at this point. He couldn't come, he was ill, and he couldn't quite manage it. So we did the TEDx, and that was fine. It all went really well. It was great meeting some brilliant people. And then I sent him the video, and he invited me up to Edinburgh to the Royal College of Surgeons, which is where he was the president at that time. And he said, look, come up, I'll buy you dinner, and we can have a chat about your talk. So I went up to Edinburgh. I was quite nervous because although it had been a long time, he was still my professor, he was still he's up here in my estimation. Anyway, I went in, his son David was there, and he said, look, here's the prof. And I went in, and he was sitting at a round table, and I sat down, and we had a hug and a smile, and I sat down. I could feel my emotions go. He just died, so it's quite, ugh. But he had his glasses here. Give yourself a grade. And I was like, no. I'm not giving myself a grade, Prof. No way, no way. He said, well, I'll tell you what, I'll give you a grade. And again, he did this with his glasses. He says, I'll give you an A. And I was like, oh, great. But this was the bit that I want you to really think about. He leant right into me and he went, but what do you think he was doing? And I think that's the second thing I want you to think of, because I think the encouragement I got from him as a mentor is something we need to think about as leaders and as individuals. But more than that, the development program that I went on, that I'm still on as a professional speaker these days, has led me to all sorts of places and to have all sorts of journeys. And I think that the investment in people, although it's quite trite to say it, I don't think companies always took it seriously. And I think if there's going to be a renaissance, we need to think about investing in our people more and really letting them do things that maybe they don't exactly add to the bottom line, but certainly let them develop, because that to me is the secret of success. I was sat in Derby. It was only 2 years ago, and I was very lucky. I was sharing a stage with Warren Buffett. You may have heard of Warren. He's one of the most successful business people in the world. And he did a talk. Now, I have to be honest, he's not a great speaker. But then again, I'm not a multi-billionaire. So, but he did his piece. And at the end, there was a sort of Q&A type thing. I hope somebody asks as good a question as this later. But there was this Q&A, and somebody said, Warren, what's the biggest issue in business today? And he sort of fumbled a little bit like that. And then he said, I'll tell you what it is. He said, it's people checking people, checking people, checking people. Now that did stick in my head, but I don't think I really understood it until I started to work with auditors, because what do? They're people who check people who check people. But that has then expanded in my thinking. And I think now in the post-COVID, well, hopefully post-COVID soon, it's made me see something that I never thought I'd ever say. Never thought I would say this. I think there's a toxin in our organizations. And I think that toxin is something that might surprise you. I think we've been hoodwinked into it by a lot of IT vendors. Sorry if you're an IT vendor. I think that toxin is key performance indicators. The place has gone mad. We're measuring everything. I had a call from a client the other day saying, I'm working as marketing director, and I won't tell you who for, but it's a very well-known and very large organization. And he said, you know what, Scott? I said, what is it? He said, they're actually monitoring my keystrokes. Every moment of his day is monitored. I think we need to get real with KPIs. I think we need to start reducing them in the post-COVID world, free up people. And I'll give you, this might surprise you as well, but I'm going to give you a KPI to help you with that. And I think if we start to reframe the way we work, if we want a renaissance post-COVID, here's an idea. Think about everything in this context. We only live for 28,000 days on average, and the last few months have put that into sharp focus with so many people dying. 28,000 days. I think our organization should be built around this KPI. Time well spent. It's such a powerful way to frame your organization. Now, I hope you've enjoyed my stories. And I think stories are part of the solution, actually. And one of my other favorite, you'll see the little astronaut there, that's from the film Interstellar. And there's a moment in Interstellar when one of the characters says this: empathy only extends as far as our line of sight. Empathy only extends as far as our line of sight. And if there's one thing that I've been disappointed with the news in the last few months, is there's not been enough stories, because you see, stories let you see how others are experiencing the world. They act as an empathy engine. I hope that the last 15, 20 minutes has acted as an empathy engine for you to start thinking about the three things. Be a gardener. Be a gardener. Think about how that could be your leadership style. Reduce the KPIs in your organization and think about time well spent. And don't forget, probably the most important thing there is at the moment is probably personal development is probably the new pension. Think about that. Personal development is probably the new pension. I hope you found that interesting. But more than anything else, when you go back to the office, maybe you're in the office or maybe you're in your bedroom like me, I've got my bed set right here. I hope that that was time well spent. Thanks very much.
Hi there, my name's Sally Brown. I'm the operations manager for an organisation called Gatwick Diamond Business. We're a membership organisation for businesses located and working in the Gatwick Diamond. And last week we delivered our annual Re-Energise conference. It's the 5th year that we've delivered this conference, and it's designed to start the year off for our business members in a motivational and inspirational way. This year we took the event online due to the pandemic, which was challenging for us, something very new. But we had some really good support from Scott McArthur, who was one of our speakers. He was very personable and very engaged from the outset, from when I first spoke to him about being involved. And then actually at the event, he gave a very engaging and thought-provoking speech. I could listen to Scott talking all day long. He really is a true storyteller. He summarises each of his stories with a very strong takeaway message. We had some fantastic feedback from our attendees, and Scott was an absolute pleasure to work with, really helpful. So thank you, Scott. Thank you for your support. Definitely time well spent.